He slid the folder across the conference table without looking at me. Not a glance, not a word. Just the folder pushed toward me like I was a clerk he was dismissing after a long meeting. My son, 43 years old, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car. I looked at the folder. I looked at him. Then I looked past him, out the window of that downtown attorney's office, at the oak trees lining the street below. They were just starting to turn. October in Ohio does that. Everything goes gold before it goes bare, I thought. I planted an oak tree the year he was born, in the backyard of the house on Clover Mill Road. I wanted something that would outlast me. I picked up the folder. Let me go back, because none of this makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning is a long time ago. I was 26 when I married my husband, Thomas. He was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that feels like safety, not distance. We built a life the slow way, the only way either of us knew. He drove a delivery truck for 17 years. I worked the front desk at an orthopedic clinic, then eventually managed the billing department. We didn't take vacations until our 40s. We clipped coupons into our 50s. We were not people who talked about money the way some people do, as though it were a personality. But we saved. Lord, we saved. The house on Clover Mill Road we bought in 1987 for $94,000. By the time Thomas passed, 6 years ago, a Tuesday morning in March, so sudden it felt like a rumor, that house was worth 11 times what we paid for it. There was also the rental property in Maplewood, a small duplex Thomas had purchased in 1999 after his mother left him a little money. There were the CDs, the IRAs, the modest investment account our financial advisor Clarence had been quietly tending for 2 decades. I didn't know the exact total until after Thomas died, and I sat down with Clarence and looked at the numbers properly. I was 67 years old, and I was by any reasonable measure comfortable. My son's name is Brandon. He's the older of my 2 children. His sister, Wendy, lives in Portland with her wife and works as a physical therapist. She calls me every Sunday. She sends cards for no reason, just Tuesday cards. Thinking of you cards. Cards with pictures of dogs wearing hats. Brandon is different. Brandon has always been different. He was a driven child, competitive in a way that was sometimes wonderful to watch and sometimes exhausting to be near. He did well in school, well in college, well in his career. He's in commercial real estate, very successful, I'm told. His wife, whose name is Serena, is a woman I tried to love for 20 years and mostly managed to tolerate. She has a way of speaking to me that is always just barely on the right side of rude. A tone. A particular way of letting silences go on too long after I've said something. After Thomas died, Brandon started calling more often. I thought it was grief. I thought he was checking on me. I understand now that he was assessing. The first conversation that should have told me something happened about 8 months after the funeral. Brandon came by the house alone. Serena was busy, he said, and we sat in the kitchen and had coffee, and he started asking questions. How was I managing the finances? Had I thought about simplifying things? Clarence was getting older, wasn't he? Had I considered moving everything to someone newer, more current? I said Clarence had been our advisor for 22 years and I had no reason to change. Brandon nodded slowly. He had a way of nodding that meant he was filing something away. A few months later, he mentioned that a colleague of his had experience with his estate planning. Very sharp, he said. Just for a second opinion. I went. I don't know why I went. Loneliness, maybe. Or the particular vulnerability of being newly widowed, when every person who shows up with a plan feels like help. The colleague's name was a man in a glass office who smiled too much and used the word streamline 17 times in 40 minutes. He suggested consolidating my assets under a new structure. He suggested. I consider giving Brandon limited power of attorney for financial matters, just to make things easier as I got older. I did not do those things. But I did start to see the shape of what was being built around me. It happened gradually, the way these things always do. A comment here. The duplex is more trouble than it's worth at your age, Mom. A suggestion there. Clarence means well, but his strategies are outdated. A slow, patient accumulation of small discouragements, each one reasonable on its own, together forming something else entirely. Serena stopped being barely polite and became openly concerned. She started calling me honey in a voice that made the word feel like a diagnosis. She mentioned memory in oblique ways. Did I remember what we'd discussed at Thanksgiving? Had I written it down? Maybe I should start writing things down. My memory is fine. I did the New York Times crossword every morning. I managed my own medication, my own appointments, my own accounts. But when someone plants a seed like that, when someone starts to suggest, gently and repeatedly, that you are slipping, you begin to wonder. That's the cruelty of it. The doubt doesn't come from inside you. It's installed. My daughter Wendy noticed during her visit the following spring. We were sitting on the back porch and she said quietly, "Mom, what's going on with Brandon?" I told her I didn't know what she meant. She said, "I talked to him last month. He mentioned he was helping you manage some things. He made it sound like you'd asked him to." I had not asked him to do anything. That was the moment I stopped wondering and started paying attention. I called Clarence the next morning. He was 71 and technically semi-retired, but he picked up on the second ring the way he always had. I told him what had been happening. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Francis, I want you to come in, and I want you to bring every piece of paper you've signed in the last 2 years." Francis, that's me. 68 years old, retired billing manager, widow, mother of 2. Woman who planted an oak tree and forgot for a while that it was still standing. Clarence and I spent 3 hours going through everything. Nothing had been transferred without my knowledge. No accounts had been changed. Whatever Brandon thought he was building, he hadn't gotten far. Not in any legal sense. But Clarence said something I've thought about every day since. He said, "Francis, the fact that nothing has happened yet doesn't mean nothing is being planned. You need to get ahead of this." Getting ahead of it meant calling an estate attorney. A real one. Not the smiling colleague in the glass office. Her name was Patricia. No, I'll call her what she told me to call her, which was Pat. She was 63, recently made partner after 25 years at the same firm, with reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain around her neck and a way of listening that made you feel like every word you said was evidence. I sat in her office for 2 hours the first time. I brought the papers Clarence had gathered. I brought Thomas's original will. I brought the deed to the house on Clover Mill Road, and the duplex and the brokerage statements and the IRA documents. I told her everything, about the colleague in the glass office, about Serena's concerned tone, about Brandon's slow, patient questions, about Wendy's call from Portland. Pat took off her glasses and let them hang. She said, "What do you want your life to look like in 10 years?" I said I wanted to stay in my house. I wanted to be able to give my grandchildren something real when the time came. I wanted to know that what Thomas and I built couldn't be taken from me by someone who thought I was too old to notice. She said, "Then let's make sure of that." What we built over the next 4 months was not dramatic. There was no single confrontation, no climactic moment, no scene from a movie. It was paperwork. Careful, deliberate, legally airtight paperwork. We established a revocable living trust that put my home and the duplex under my sole control, with Wendy named as successor trustee. We updated the beneficiary designations on the IRAs and investment accounts. We clarified the will. We documented everything. The concerns, the conversations, the timeline of what Brandon had suggested and when. Pat explained something I hadn't understood before. That a trust, properly structured, doesn't just protect your assets. It makes your wishes nearly impossible to contest. It creates a record. It puts the law on the side of the person who did the planning. I did the planning. Wendy knew everything. Brandon knew nothing. The folder he slid across the conference table that October morning was his idea of a conclusion. He had called me 2 weeks earlier and suggested we meet, he and Serena and I, and a financial advisor he trusted. Neutral ground, he said, just to talk about the future, just to make sure everything was organized. I said that sounded fine. I did not tell him I had already spoken to Pat. I did not tell him that Wendy had flown in from Portland and was at that moment sitting in Pat's office 3 blocks away, waiting for my call. The conference room was on the 14th floor. Serena was there in a blazer with a notepad. The advisor, a young man I'd never met, had a laptop open and his hands folded like he was about to deliver a presentation at a company I had no stake in. Brandon looked tired, or maybe not tired. Maybe just caught somewhere between confidence and something else. He explained, in very measured language, that he and Serena had been thinking about my situation. That the house was a lot of maintenance for one person. That the rental property was generating headaches and the management company I used was, in his view, not optimal. That Clarence, with all due respect, was operating with an outdated philosophy. He said that what made the most sense going forward was to consolidate everything. He produced the folder. Inside were documents, transfer forms, updated beneficiary designations, a proposed financial power of attorney. He slid it toward me and said, "We think this is the best way to take care of you, Mom." There it was, take care of you. 3 words that meant, hand it over. I looked at the folder for a long moment. Then I opened my own bag. I'd carried the same handbag for 4 years. Brown leather, a little worn at the corners, a gift from Thomas for our 38th anniversary. Inside it, that morning, I had a letter from Pat's office summarizing the trust documents, the updated will, and the full legal structure we'd put in place over the previous 4 months. I placed the letter on the table. I said, I have something, too. Brandon looked at the papers. He looked at me. Something shifted in his face, not anger, not yet. More like miscalculation. I walked him through it calmly. The trust, the assets, Wendy as successor trustee, the beneficiary updates, everything legal, everything signed, everything witnessed and notarized and filed. The young advisor closed his laptop. Serena put down her pen. Brandon said, "When did you do this?" I said, "A while ago." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that question for a moment. I thought about the colleague in the glass office and the word streamline. I thought about Serena calling me honey in that particular voice. I thought about Thomas, who never once in 39 years made me feel like a problem to be managed. I said, I didn't think I needed to. We sat there for a while. The young advisor was very still. Outside the window, the oak trees along the street were fully gold now. Brandon said quietly, "This isn't what I intended." I don't know if that was true. I've thought about it many times since. I think he believed some version of it, that he was helping, that he knew better, that being decisive was the same as being right. I think he'd convinced himself so thoroughly that I needed management that he'd stopped seeing me as a person who was capable of deciding things. I said, "I know you love me. And I know this isn't easy to hear, but this is my life, and I've taken care of it." I picked up my letter. I put it back in my bag. I stood up. I did not feel triumphant, exactly. I want to be honest about that, because the feeling people expect, the dramatic satisfaction, the movie moment victory, that's not what it was. What I felt was quieter than that, more solid, like something had been restored that I hadn't even realized was missing until it came back. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button for the lobby. When the doors closed and I was alone, I called Wendy. She picked up on the first ring. I said, "It's done." She said, "Are you okay?" I stood there in the elevator holding the phone and I thought about that. Am I okay? I said, "I think I'm better than okay." She started crying very quietly, the kind of crying that isn't sad, the kind that comes when something has finally been put right. That was 14 months ago. Brandon and I don't speak the way we used to. I won't pretend otherwise. He sent a letter a few weeks after the meeting, measured and careful, and I wrote back in the same tone. "We have reached a kind of peace. Not warmth exactly, but something civil. Wendy says give it time. Maybe she's right. She's wiser than both of us. I am still in the house on Clover Mill Road. The oak tree in the backyard is 43 years old now, and it is enormous. Some mornings I stand at the kitchen window with my coffee and look at it, and I think about all the winters it's been through, all the times it looked bare and people might have thought it was finished. It's not a sad thought, it's actually the opposite. Thomas used to say that the problem with most people is they confuse silence for surrender. He was a quiet man, my Thomas, but he was never, not once, surrendering. I think of that now whenever I stand at the window. I think, I am still here. I am not waiting for someone to take care of me. I am not a chapter in someone else's plan. My house is mine. My name is on the trust. My daughter calls every Sunday. And some things, the ones you build carefully, the ones you plant in faith, they outlast everything.